Welcome back everyone, I'm the Book Guy, and today we're talking about The Name of the Wind and the Kingkiller Chronicles. As always, I'm here to give you a spoiler-free introduction and overview of this series to help you decide if you want to read it. People have been requesting this video for a while because Kingkiller is so popular. I've been hearing people for years calling this one of the best fantasy books ever. It's won all these awards, it's hugely successful, but I've also heard a lot of people call it overrated. So why the big divide? Here's the problem. This series is almost too famous. When someone says best fantasy ever, you probably expect a certain thing. If I picture the best fantasy ever, I probably picture a noble hero with a magic sword, blessed with divine light, fighting to save a beautiful princess from the clutches of a pure evil maniac, and there's probably some demons, and dragons, and demon dragons! You know what, maybe I'm just picturing The Legend of Zelda. My point is, you need to have your expectations in the right place if you're going to enjoy this story. It's not what you might expect if someone says best fantasy ever. It's not full of fantasy tropes or great heroic deeds. It's a great fantasy story, yes, but it's not that epic. Kingkiller has reached a point where its reputation oversells the story to the point of being misleading. The true beauty of the story is in the fact that it doesn't use fantasy tropes at all. It's very original and unique because this is a gentle fantasy. The first time I read this series, I was expecting something huge and world-shattering. Yet I found it to be kind of boring and anticlimactic and, yes, overrated. But I reread the series in preparation for today's video and I genuinely loved it because I knew what to expect this time. It's not my idea of the best fantasy ever, but it's a great series. One thing before we actually start, I am discussing both novels and both novellas today, including the recent release The Narrow Road Between Desires. And yes, I know it's not on my shelf right now, but that's because my collection is in paperback and that book is only available in hardback, and once again I refuse to buy a new release that's only available in a format that doesn't match my current set, and it's ridiculous that publishers do this every time and refuse to make paperback available at the time of release and make you wait several months.
Apparently that's a trigger for me. Yeah.
But yes, we're discussing the new one. And of course, the elephant in the room, that is the unpublished third book. Anyway, let's go. In a small town in a forgotten corner of the world, Kvothe, the humble innkeeper, runs the Waystone Inn. He's a quiet man who keeps to himself, and he's well liked by the other villagers. Kvothe hears stories from the people who come to his inn, stories of Taborlin the Great, and his fight against the evil Shandarin, where he calls the name of the wind. He hears rumors of demons running in the countryside, and the king recruiting soldiers to fight a mighty war. But that's all faraway news, nothing to do with Kvothe, until a stranger comes to town, and recognizes him. Kvothe is no humble innkeeper, he's Kvothe. Kvothe the Dragon Slayer, Kvothe the greatest magician of the age, Kvothe the sword fighter, musician, and king killer. So why is the great wizard Kvothe hiding in a small town? And what does he know about the troubles that currently ravage the world? Kvothe agrees to tell this traveler his story. Not the grandiose heroic tale that everyone knows by its reputation. No, for the first time, Kvothe is going to tell the true story of his life. This is the biggest and best selling point for the series. The writing prose in the series is absolutely freaking gorgeous. Every line of dialogue, every description is written like music. There's a rise and fall of tempo, the soft moments, the crescendos, the ebbs and flows of subtle notes that tug on your heartstrings in ways you can't explain, yet you feel it to be true. This is less like writing a novel and more like storytelling, where the telling itself is part of the story. Now here's the thing, beautiful writing is great if you're into it. But that's a matter of personal taste. Some of you might be underwhelmed by fancy writing and just prefer a good story. If that's you, you might struggle with this series. There are times in this series where you get so many beautiful descriptions in a row, but then you sit back and think, wait, has anything actually happened for a while? Yeah, the series can be pretty slow.
2, 9,
Now, writing prose is a rather nuanced aspect of the writing art form. Some authors are very blunt with their language. They're short, efficient, and just get to the point. Others make every word and line beautiful. So if a character jumps off a roof, one author might say he jumped off a roof. Another might describe the emotions and the depths of fear, the sensation of falling, wind rustling, clothes flapping, and paint such a vivid picture of this scene. Which of those options is correct? Both. It kind of depends on the story and the style you're going for. One is not inherently better. This is part of the art form. Like I said, it comes down to personal taste. I believe that prose is one of those things that actually separates books from other formats of storytelling, like games, film, and TV. So why not use it? It's similar to a movie, where a tilted camera can give you that sense of unease. So stories thrive when you use the special techniques available only to that format. Anyway, Rothfuss goes hard on the prose. That's the takeaway. Whether or not that's a good thing depends entirely on you. This story switches between two points of view. We have the older Kvothe, known as Kvothe the innkeeper, and the scenes with him. He's an older man with ambiguous age, and they're all told from third-person mode. Then we have his life story as a young man, and that's told in first-person mode. Now, I'm going to keep this segment spoiler-free, don't worry, but the two main plot lines of the whole series revolve around the two goals of young Kvothe. Number one, getting his education at the University of Arcane Arts. And number two, discovering the mystery of the Chandrian. These are both just such brilliant plot lines, and I love them so much. So Kvothe is a child of the Adema Ru, traveling performers and musicians. It's an adventurous lifestyle, but they are desperately poor. Now, Kvothe shows at a very young age he's unusually smart. He should go to the university, but how is he ever going to afford to get there? I love this plotline so much because it's so unusual for fantasy. The enemy here is not a dark lord or a big monster. It's poverty. In fact, most of this series is about a struggle with poverty. And getting to the university is only half the battle. The other half is being able to afford to stay there. It's such a mundane challenge for such an epic fantasy series. But it defies tropes, and it makes the character very sympathetic and relatable to a lot of us. The second major plotline is the Chandrian. And I'm going to be very careful with this because this is the big mystery of the series. So the Chandrian are a cryptid of this world. So a cryptid is, unverifiable monsters like Bigfoot or Loch Ness. Like a boogeyman monster that lurks in the dark. We don't really know who or what the Chandrian are, or what they do. The one thing we do know is that they tend to destroy information about themselves to keep their secrets. So, naturally, Kvothe wants to find out everything about them. That is such a compelling plot line, and I wish I could say more. So those are the two main plots that are the focus of the series. That said, there are two subplots to the series. One is about a particularly special girl called Dana, and we're going to talk about her more in the character segment. The other subplot is the name of the wind. So there are two magic systems in this series, and the books explore them both at great length. We have sympathy and naming. So sympathy first is the art of linking two objects together with your mind. So if you have two coins, you link them together with your mind, and then when you lift one of them, the other mirrors it, and they go in unison. The trick is that some things link better than others. Two coins would be a strong link because they're identical, but linking something metal with something paper would be a much weaker link. This is a very unique magic system because it's so limited. There's not that many applications at first glance. This doesn't sound like an all-powerful magic of summoning lightning and casting fireballs, yet this magic system rewards you for clever ideas, and that's what makes it so satisfying to read. That said, this second magic system, naming, is a little bit more traditional. So it's the magic straight out of Earthsea, where magic comes from knowing the true name of things. If you know its true name, you have power over that thing. As you might expect, book one is about finding the name of the wind. I love that this series has such a meticulous and finicky hard magic system of sympathy versus a more traditional and soft magic system of naming. They work so well together, both as in-world magics and as storytelling concepts. Magic is a highlight of this series. Now, how to describe the world building? I've been thinking about this one a lot. You see, the world of Kingkiller is very un-fantasy. Now, don't get mad at me, let me explain. The series defies so many fantasy tropes. It's so original. There's no chosen one, it's not a good versus evil battle, no reluctant hero or great quest or damsel in distress or secret royalty, etc. I mean, there are some tropes, obviously, because it's storytelling and tropes are unavoidable, but a lot of fantasy tropes are actually subverted in clever ways, which I can't talk about. One of the tropes that do get subverted is the world building. So unlike most fantasy series, this one's very straightforward and easy to get into. It's not that complex of a world. In fact, the series almost does not need to be fantasy at all. It could very easily have been set in medieval Europe if you just removed key things like the magic system. It's that soft on the fantasy side of things. But the real fantasy element of this world comes in the form of stories. This is a world of stories. So for one, we have the older Kvothe as Kvothe the innkeeper, telling his life story. But we also establish from the start that young Kvothe is one of the Idema Ru, the storytelling musicians, for who storytelling is a way of life. Over the course of this series, we hear many stories about the ancient world. Old folk tales, campfire stories, urban myths and songs, all of which tell a part of the truth. We hear of the creation war, Torbalin the Great, and demons that used to walk the earth, and even sometimes the Chandrian. So if we piece together all of these ancient stories, we get a sense of a world that is vast and ancient and magical. Yet for the most part, the present day seems pretty normal. It's a fascinating style of world building. Just to be clear, there are some weird fantasy stuff in the present day, but I'm avoiding spoilers. The final piece of this concept is Kvothe's own story. So we see a pretty significant difference between the rumors that spread about him and the truth of his life. That's why he's telling this story, to set the record straight. While it's true that young Kvothe does some pretty awesome things, we also see how it's a little less fantastic than it seems. There's a science behind his magic, for example. Yet we also see how grandiose the story becomes with its every retelling. Older Kvothe and the story itself is showing how people like him too much and idealize him too much. Speaking of which, now, this is a bit of a tricky segment because there's a decent amount of characters in this series and some excellent character writing, but there's also some character work that gets criticized. So to try to give you a balanced overview of what to expect, I'm going to take 3 major characters and list some of the criticisms against them as well. This should give you an idea of what we're dealing with here. So we're looking at Kvothe himself, Dana, and Ambrose. Kvothe, and specifically young Kvothe in the story, is kind of what you would expect from a teenage boy. He's young, brash, reckless, but also ambitious and driven. Yet Kvothe has none of the awkwardness that most teenage boys seem to have. Kvothe is just too cool. And he's always the smartest one in the room, he's charming, yet he knows how to lie, and has proven himself to be a talented liar when he deems it necessary. The criticism of Kvothe's character is that he's too smart and too perfect. But we'll circle back to that one. Dana is a courtesan and a musician and a con artist. She is a beautiful, quick-witted and charming woman who is fiercely independent. She naturally attracts a lot of rich men and allows them to woo her for a time but never stays long. She forms a friendship with Kvothe, but he knows that she will flee if he tries to claim her in any way. So she can be quite temperamental, but it's also a way to hide her vulnerabilities. The criticism of Dana is that she's so wild and unpredictable because she's a woman. I kind of agree, but you see what you think. And Ambrose is the son of, the richest family in the world. He's inherited everything in life that Kvothe has had to work and suffer to gain. And Ambrose is the most entitled, selfish, arrogant rich kid you could ever meet. But he's also genuinely smart and comes up with many clever ways to be a foil to Kvothe. The criticism of Ambrose is that he is a one-dimensional character. This criticism, in my opinion, is true, but I don't think it's a bad thing. If you've ever watched the first 5 seasons of MASH, you would have met Frank Burns. He's a one-dimensional antagonist, absolutely. He's an incompetent surgeon and generally a foolish person, yet he also keeps getting promoted. Frank Burns is annoying because he's painfully realistic. We all know a Frank Burns. The actor based him off, I quote, every idiot I've ever met. When war veterans watched MASH, they all agreed they knew a Frank Burns. So Ambrose as a one-dimensional character is perfect, because we all know an Ambrose. Someone who's spoiled and entitled and has never bothered to develop other character traits. He's the most realistic character here. Alright, now we have to talk about one of the biggest criticisms of the series. Kvothe is the focus of the whole story, so a lot depends on getting his characterization just right. Yet as a character, Kvothe is almost a little too perfect. I think we're meant to think that. See, the young Kvothe is full of a reckless desire to prove himself. The older Kvothe is much more broken. Clearly, something has happened in between to humble him. So there's deliberately meant to be a disconnect, a juxtaposition between young and old Kvothe. I think young Kvothe is meant to be so over the top that he feels invincible. But part of the criticism is that Kvothe is simply too intelligent. He picks things up too quickly to be realistic, hence the Mary Sue label that's often attached to him. However, I have a bit of a different opinion to the majority on this one. Yep, so it's personal opinion time. I never do this. I think Kvothe is not awkward enough, and that's the real problem. So Kvothe is for most of the story a teenager, yet he's confident and charming. I don't know about you, but I've never met a teenager who is this confident. Every teenager is awkward as hell, because that's the phase of life you're in. You're transitioning from childhood to adulthood, so everything is new and unfamiliar, you've got a lot to figure out, and you will make a ton of mistakes along the way because that's how we learn. Kvothe just simply doesn't have any of that learning awkwardness. We're meant to accept this because he's so intelligent, he just bypasses the weird learning phase we all go through. I think that's why so many fans love Kvothe, because he's us, but a cool, super non-awkward version of us that we all kind of wished we were.
How do you do, fellow kids?
What?
But I personally don't think he's flawed enough. Now brace yourself. I'm about to say something very, very offensive. But I wish Kvothe was more like Shallan.
Oh yeah, give me your booze. I am nourished by your hatred.
Okay, Shallan from the Stormlight archive is often criticized for her cringe humor and her awkwardness and the mistakes she makes. Yet Shallan is approximately 18 years old at the start of that series. This is normal behavior for someone of that age. Some people like to say her awkwardness is a sign of bad writing, but I think we as readers just hate to be reminded of our awkward teenage years, and we prefer a character like Kvothe who's super cool all the time, even if it's unrealistic. So I don't think Kvothe's uber intelligence is what makes him too perfect. I think it's the confidence and the total lack of social missteps that kind of go too far. This leads me to another important topic. This is a major theme in all of the series, but I want to set the record straight a bit today. You see, yes, our protagonist is extremely intelligent, but I don't think it's about author wish fulfillment. I think it's a commentary on intelligence in society and how we view it. So besides Kvothe himself, we see common townsfolk in Coates Inn discussing old tales and rumours of the world, and many of them are quick to grasp at straws and fail to understand the deeper meaning of things. We see a ton of people with mental disabilities that affect their intelligence. There are wealthy kids who've never applied themselves to their education, and we have poor kids who've had to claw tooth and nail for every scrap of education they can get. And I think all of this is put in the story deliberately as part of the storytelling. People tend to over-focus on Kvothe and his natural talent. But this series is looking at intelligence in all its forms, and offers even a little bit of social commentary, and I would interpret the message as intelligence affects us all differently, but what's important is how you use it.
Intelligence is not a privilege, it's a gift, and you use it for the good of mankind.
I touch on this theme because I think there's a certain subgroup among the Kingkiller fans who like this series just because it's got a smart main character and it makes them feel good about themselves. And it can lead to a bit of a misassumption about the series too, that because the main character is smart, it's a smart series, and if you don't like it, it's cause you're dumb. It's not that simple. This topic gets debated a lot in the fandom, and I find it honestly a little bit frustrating because that's not what the book is about. It's a look at all of society's intelligence, and also all the factors that can affect someone's mental ability. So narrowing it down to book character smart, book smart. It's not really the point here. But that's all I'll say about that. Everything we've talked about so far has been about the series on a whole, but I do want to get a little bit more specific here and look at each individual book and break it down just a little bit further. So this sequel was very highly anticipated in the fantasy community at the time. The Name of the Wind was a debut novel that won a bunch of awards, and so the hype was high for Book 2. Yet a hard majority of people still say that Book 2 is not as good and very weird. Now, I do see it both ways. The first time I read it, Book 2 was not as good for me. The second time, I loved it more. I now consider The Wise Man's Fear to be far superior out of the two. It's tricky to say why without spoilers, but I'll simplify it and say Book 1 does not have a lot in the way of fantasy elements, as I said earlier, but Book 2 does, and it's much more fantastical and epic. The reason I think people like Book 1 more is because Book 1 always has a very clear goal. Young Kvothe wants to get his education at the university. Book 2, the goal changes a little bit, and a couple of times. The plot feels a lot more random in places, and there are log segments where you're kind of wondering, where's he going with this? Again, the expectations of the reader can impact how much you enjoy the story. As for the weird stuff, well, this book it's more sexual. And let's face it, people get weird when there's sexual content in a book. And if that's you, that is totally fine, really. I just find it funny because sex is natural and people freak out about it. Yet violence is very unnatural, but everyone's okay with it? Anyway, so there are two sections in Book 2 that have a lot of sexual content. Some readers have criticized these segments for being shameless wish fulfillment, which is kind of hilarious. It's like the critics are saying, aha, you just want sex. And the response is, yeah.
You got me.
Sorry. The point is, the sexual content in this series is what you might call liberal. There's a culture of people that practice a form of ethical non-monogamy, and you have clear conversations around consent, and in general show a lot of active and healthy sexuality. It might be a bit confronting for some readers. Now, as long as you don't mind those differences, I think you will enjoy Book 2 just as much, if not more, than the first. Now, let's discuss the two novellas. Alright, people often call this one weird.
It's an oversimplification of events, but yeah.
What you need to understand is this book is not a story. It's what we call a vignette. It's a French word that means a brief, evocative description of a person, place, or time. So it's not so much a story as it is a very detailed picture of one particular situation. For context, you might recall I have an arts degree and a minor in literature. Well, my university professors used to give us vignettes to study all the time, and it drove me crazy. I'd always cry, but nothing happened. And they'd be like, but the writing is so beautiful.
Who the hell cares?
I remember one vignette we studied in university that was just 12 pages of an old guy sitting in his house, thinking about his retirement and his life and looking at his possessions. And I'm like, why are we reading this? And then there was whole books we had to study that were written in this style. Hundreds of pages with nothing happening.
Apparently that's a trigger for me.
Yeah. These types of stories are boring, but they're beautiful writing. So for this novella, think less, commercial popular fiction and more literary fiction, a higher focus on art form. The story itself, or the scene, if you will, is about our side character, Aori. So Aori is a young girl who lives underneath the university in the catacombs. She has a mental disability. She was not born with it, but it's the result of some unknown injury or event. So now she lives a simple, quiet life of isolation. This book shows the inherent beauty of someone who is broken yet whole. Again, this book links into the greater theme of intelligence. Here we have someone whose intelligence is limited by things outside of their control, yet we still see the value and the beauty of this precious soul. Aori is just as human as the brilliant Kvothe, even if her life does not have his grandiose goals. This book does not contribute much to the wider plot of the series, but it is still beautiful nonetheless. This novella is completely different to the last one. This is a conventional story with a beginning, middle, and end. And it's definitely up there with some of Rothfuss's best writing. That said, it is similar to the first novella in that it depicts one day in the life of one of the side characters. This time it is Bast, the assistant and student to the older Kvothe in the present day. Bast is a bit of a sinister character. I have to avoid specifics here because there are spoilers, but let's say you're not quite sure what this guy's alignment is. Good, neutral, evil? Genuinely can't say. It's a little bit unclear. The story is about Bast interacting with the children of this village, where his master Kvothe lives. Bast hears about their plights. Sometimes he lies and cheats with them, sometimes he helps. It's an intriguing story that dances a fine line of moral ambiguity, with some very satisfying results. It's also a little bit sexual, like Book 2. It also includes some artwork which you might classify as pornographic, depending on your definition of it. I don't know if that's incentive to read it or not. There was one artwork of a particularly sexy guy and another of a particularly sexy girl. I couldn't choose between them. But that's just me. Hey. Anyway, that novella is also a really good starting place for the series. So if you're intrigued by this series, but you're a little put off by the fact that Name of the Wind is 650 pages and Wise Man's Fear is almost 1,000, well, yeah, try this little novella. It's a great starting place. It's set in present day with a much older Kvothe, so it doesn't spoil the story that we're focused on, which is younger Kvothe's backstory. Now, let's address the slightly more negative aspects of this series. Alright, moment of truth time. This is why I've been putting off making this video about the series, because I want to make videos that help you get excited about reading. I want them to be positive and uplifting and inspiring, but this topic just sucks. This is a gross topic, there's no saving grace, there's no positive spin, it's just the worst. So let's just rip this band-aid off nice and quick, shall we? This series is infamously unfinished. Book 1 came out in 2007, Book 2 came out in 2011, and that's it. We have been waiting 13 years for the next one. Now you might say, oh, it's like George Martin with The Winds of Winter. Not really. George knows people are waiting for his book and has put up with some online abuse from them. Yet overall, I would argue that George has had a rather good-natured response overall, apologizing, trying to give updates, keeping it polite. Rothfuss, on the other hand, has become increasingly antagonistic towards his fans. Though, to be fair, his fans have become increasingly antagonistic towards him too. George Martin has been working on other projects and released other books, worked as a producer on TV shows, other projects, etc. Rothfuss has just done the 2 novellas. George has released a total of 11 chapters of Winds of Winter that are available online. You can literally go Google them now and read over 100 pages of Winds of Winter content. So there's hard evidence that George is actually working on his book. Rothfuss, on the other hand, has the infamous missing chapter debacle. If you haven't heard of this controversy, in December 2021, Rothfuss was promoting a charity drive for his charity, which he helped form, World Builders, a charity that offers food, education for undeveloped countries. So, pretty great thing to do. Go Patrick! Except, to help with the fundraiser, he promised that if they hit a fundraising goal, he would release a chapter for Doors of Stone, the unpublished 3rd book. The fundraiser suddenly spiked in interest and people donated over $1 million. Then Rothfuss said, oh, it would take a month to get that chapter ready. Then it became 2 months. Then it became 6 months. And now it's become 2.5 years. And the chapter is still missing. Literally, 2.5 years, not one chapter. I'm trying to be objective here, but this strongly suggests 2 things. That he has not completed a single chapter of Book 3, and that he knowingly and intentionally manipulated fans out of $1 million. For charity, but still. Now, in his defense, Rothfuss admits he is a perfectionist to an obsessive level, that he rewrites and cannot let things go until it is done perfectly. Some fans say, hey, that writing style clearly works for him because his first 2 books are so good. Yet I can't help think that that writing style is no longer working for him. There's one other big difference here between the unfinished Winds of Winter and unfinished Doors of Stone. The Game of Thrones series has kind of paused in the middle. The story is not unresolved so much as it simply stops. Yet Kingkiller Book 2 ends with a massive hype. Because it's a trilogy, the ending is deliberately open and vague and has a huge build-up and emphasis on more things to come. Please come read the next book. The big final answer to Kvothe's life will be revealed, so it's especially frustrating because of how much hype book 2 ends on. Okay, so those are simply the facts of the situation, and I'm doing my very best to keep all of my opinions on this to myself. So please do with that information what you will. If you decide you don't want to try the series because you don't like the ending situation, that's okay. And if you decide you can live with it, by all means, read this series as it stands. The choice is yours. Alright, let's wrap up this video with a couple of closing segments. So looking at representation, this series is a little male dominated, but there are a couple of women spread out throughout consistently. That said, the female lead, Dana, can be a little bit too much of a goddess. The story raises her up on such a pedestal, yet this is also because that's how Kvothe sees her, and he's narrating the story, and he might be a bit unreliable. It's a topic of some debate within the fandom. Is she too perfect as well? There's a lot of talk about race in this series. We see racial prejudice towards the Edema Rue. We have Kvothe's close friend, Willem, who is a foreigner trying to learn the language. And we later have Kvothe as a foreigner in another country and trying to learn and have an open mind regarding their culture. This is all handled very well, and it's actually a great depiction of multiculturalism. We have a ton of disability rep in this series. So book 1 features an orphanage for homeless kids, many of them with severe disabilities and needing 24/7 care. In fact, the audiobook here is narrated by Rupert Dacus, and he does a voice of a young child who has a neurological impairment and cannot form words correctly. While it was initially confronting to hear, it's actually a beautiful representation that humanizes people like this. There is only a hint of LGBT in this series, though it's just a few blink and you'll miss it references, nothing too major. A content warning, the series is not particularly violent or graphic for the most part. There is a violent sequence in book 2 and that's it, and again a little bit of sexual content in book 2. The only thing to watch out for is actually a little bit of child violence in book 1. Kvothe has a rough childhood. Other than that, we're mostly good on the content here. Is the ending worth it? No, it's not worth it. That was a great segment. That's why you come to this channel, for information like that, yeah. Well, how much should you try? Well, try book 1. The Name of the Wind truly is a fantastic novel, and really will challenge your view on what fantasy can be. If you're not sure if you want to read such a big novel, you really can try the recent novella, The Narrow Road Between Desires, for a shorter, more succinct glimpse of the world and of Rothfuss's writing style. Whatever you choose, I hope you now know if this series is right for you. Thank you for watching. I'm the Book Guy, and make sure you comment your thoughts on this series below, and we can have a chat because I love to chat with you guys about these books. Subscribe if you want to see more breakdowns like this that will help you find your next favorite book. If you want to support me, you can check out my Patreon or my shop, links in the description below. Also, my Patreons do get to vote on my content, so you can have your say on there. I am taking a short week off for a holiday, but I will be back ASAP with Lightbringer and Licanius. I hope to see you there for those videos. I hope my work is inspiring you to keep reading and to have good, healthy reading habits. Thank you all so much for coming along on this journey with me as we explore so many books. I will see you next time, and I hope you enjoy a good book today. Bye!